Car Crash While Hitchhiking by Denis Johnson is a very famous story that's been written just within the last 30 years. And it offers a lot of things that I think are exemplary elements of how to write a good story while not giving away too much. It has action, it has craziness, it has a strange narrator, it has hallucinations, it has death, it has pretty much everything you need. The primary thing that it offers, though, that I think is particularly exemplary are a number of truly stunningly beautiful lines, just things that are excellently written. For example, towards the beginning of the story, it says, "The traveling salesman had fed me pills that made the linings of my veins feel scraped out. My jaw ached. I knew every raindrop by its name." Just a beautiful line. Later on, "Under Midwestern clouds like great gray brains." Just a nice image. Also, fantastically, later on, a really famous moment after the accident in which a man was hanging out of a car, practically dead. It says, "I stopped, grown a little more used to the idea now of how really badly broken he was, and made sure there was nothing I could do. He was snoring loudly and rudely. His blood bubbled out of his mouth with every breath. He wouldn't be taking many more. I knew that, but he didn't, and therefore I looked down into the great pity of a person's life on this earth. I don't mean that we all end up dead. That's not the great pity. I mean that he couldn't tell me what he was dreaming, and I couldn't tell him what was real." There's just a lot of profundity to that end. I mean, he couldn't tell me what he was dreaming, and I couldn't tell him what was real. There's definitely a lot that you can continue to think about with that line. And then perhaps the most famous passage in this story is when the wife comes to the hospital and has to be told that her husband has died. The famous paragraph goes, "Down the hall came the wife. She was glorious, burning. She didn't know yet that her husband was dead. We knew. That's what gave her such power over us." I think that spot is really particularly interesting because most people would think that the people who know are the ones that have the power, and the one who does not know does not have the power. But Johnson inverts that relationship here because, in a sense, to not know that the world includes death, to not know that something terrible has happened, really does put you in a position of power where everyone else's innocence has already been removed. Then that paragraph continues. "The doctor took her into a room with a desk at the end of the hall, and from under the closed door a slab of brilliance radiated as if, by some stupendous process, diamonds were being incinerated in there. What a pair of lungs!" she shrieked as I imagined an eagle would shriek. It felt wonderful to be alive to hear it. I've gone looking for that feeling everywhere. There's something kind of morbid about that, right? The fact that he felt wonderful to be alive to hear somebody else's terrible agony, but in a sense, him being able to experience that agony of another person is something really acutely beautiful in his own life. And that's something interesting about this character that's totally strange, because in this character, we have in this character and in this story, we have an entire cast of people who are in their own way totally unredeemable and terrible. There aren't too many people to root for in this story. For example, the salesman, who's drinking and driving all the way. Not only that, but he says he's blessed with love because he has the opportunity to cheat on his wife. There's also the Cherokee, who we don't get to know too terribly well, but we do know that he's doing drugs while driving. Then there's also the truck driver, who upon stumbling upon a terrible accident, decides that he's not going to do anything about it, instead merely pouring himself another cup of coffee. And then there's the family, the people with the sweet voices inside the car, but even them are irresponsible enough that they're letting their baby sit on the seat of the car without a seatbelt. So all of these people are all part of something a little bit less than good. And that's not even mentioning our main character. So, about that main character, who is he? At face value, this is simply the story of a drug abuser. Somebody who's hitchhiking and goes from car to car to car, just doing drugs and being irresponsible. It's a very straightforward tale of somebody who's has this happen to him. He's involved in a car accident. He doesn't really want to help anybody, and then that's kind of it. Okay, and we have to ask the question, do we trust this guy at all? Because all the descriptions that he's giving us are taking place while he is under the influence. So there's the problem there. But here's the big thing. This story would only be kind of a curiosity if it were just the story of somebody who were doing drugs. But this is where we come back to that issue of what happens and what does it mean. And the big issue here is that, in a sense, this story can be read in a much grander way than just seeing the narrator as a drug abuser. The name of the book that this story comes out of is called Jesus' Son. It's one of the most famous books of short stories written in the last 30 years, and that Jesus' Son theme follows the narrator through the entire book. This story, in fact, is the first story in that collection. And that brings up the issue that quite possibly our narrator in this story is Jesus' son, and that's who he's meant to represent. So, that might seem really crazy at face value, but when you look at it a little bit more closely, you can see pieces of evidence that would support the idea that this drug abuser is in fact somebody symbolic of the Son of Jesus. For example, he says things like, "I knew every raindrop by its name." You could read that as just a drug abuser being crazy, or somebody who is quite literally godlike, who actually does know the name of every raindrop. Also, for instances, there is the fact that he does seem to know the future. It says, "I knew a certain Oldsmobile would stop for me even before it slowed, and by the sweet voices of the family inside it, I knew we'd have an accident in the storm." Okay, and then later on he says, "You were the ones, I thought." So he says even later, "I'd known all along exactly what was going to happen." So there are all these little hints that suggest that he does have some sort of clairvoyance, that he has the ability to see into the future. This is the kind of ability that Jesus' son would have. Then there also is the strange issue that he feels as if people want him to help, but he's not really in the position to help. And that brings us to the end of the story, okay, in which we jump far ahead, okay? We're no longer here in the same scene anymore. We've passed into the future in which our main character is in a psychiatric hospital, okay? And he's hallucinating things. He's seeing things that aren't there, okay? And then it ends. "It was raining. Gigantic ferns leaned over us. The forest drifted down a hill. I could hear a creek rushing down among the rocks. And you ridiculous people, you expect me to help you." So, if this is a story about a drug abuser, that's not particularly compelling. If this is a story about the Son of Jesus, then it is. And you ridiculous people, you expect me to help you. And you have to think of him not as Jesus himself, but as somebody who, as the son of a prophet and as the son of a savior, would be somebody who maybe would have trouble living up to it. Okay, somebody who would seek the outlet of drugs and alcohol as a means to shirk the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. Somebody who others would look to for help, but he would not want to give them that help. So, my imploration to you as the reader is that most likely when you read through this story the first time, you just read it as a story of a drug user. And, it's interesting as that. We have all these things, we have all these beautiful lines. So now, I would ask of you to go back, look back through the story, and think about it a little bit differently. What if our narrator here is more than a drug user? What if he actually is the prophet that he does seem in some ways to be? Ask that question and watch the story open up for you.